When I first started playing Warframe, it was around the time of Chroma Prime Access, and Chroma was my very first Prime Warframe. That was a different time, no steel path, no arbitrations, self-damage, the long wait for the new war, and Chroma was the very best at killing Eidolons with his signature Rubico and Hiko with concealed explosives. I took a long break from Warframe right after the Heart of Deimos. I completed the story, and then I left to play other games. I hadn't even installed the Helminth Infusion segment when I took my break, and already back then, Rhino's Roar was the best Subsumed ability. In the present day, I've come full circle in my gaming journey. I started playing the game that truly ignited my love for weird and wacky builds, stuff that shouldn't work, stuff that works just well enough but isn't necessarily the best of the best of the best, and I've been having a lot of fun playing my favorite Warframe, Chroma. Despite his usage stats dropping off a cliff since 2020, from 1.58% to 0.74%, which is a 53.2% drop, I think he deserves a little bit more love than he's currently getting. As I write this script, be it by some divine providence or sheer coincidence, the idea for this project actually came about on Chroma's 10-year anniversary of March 19th. He was released in 2015. Now, at the risk of rambling, let me introduce Chroma's abilities. Chroma has two passives. The first is really quite straightforward. He has an extra jump. I used to not really like this ability, but the added movement this extra jump gives Chroma is surprisingly nice. His second defines his entire kit. His abilities are elementally aligned with one of heat, electricity, toxin, or cold. His primary emissive color determines his starting type, but it can be cycled in mission with his first ability, which leads me perfectly into Spectral Scream, Chroma's first ability. Chroma breathes fire like a true dragon. In gameplay terms, that means Chroma channels 3 energy per second to do elemental damage in a 10-meter cone in front of him, affected by range, dealing 400 damage per second of his aligned energy type with a 100% status chance, and enemies can spread the damage to one other enemy within 10 meters. This ability also locks him out of using his guns for the duration of the channel, though melee weapons can still be used. There's no sugarcoating it, this ability is bad. At base, the range is effectively melee, the drain is ridiculous, and the damage is poor. Even if you can increase the damage with his third ability, it struggles to effectively clear at least chaff enemies in the steel path. The best use I've found for the ability is in its elemental application. Condition Overload really appreciates the additional status. His first ability has an augment, and it's worse than having no mod equipped on your build, which tracks with its release date of March 19th, 2015, which is also the last time it was changed, and coincidentally, Chroma's release date. Don't use it. The augment is called Afterburn, and will store damage for every second Spectral Scream has been active, but the damage is capped. The damage scales at 5:1 with power strength, so at 100%, the maximum damage of the ability is 500. At 401%, the maximum damage is 2005. Not only is the damage maximum of the ability capped, the mod description is misleading. The card says damage per second, and on first glance, someone could assume this means that the damage of the final fireball would increase by that much. Instead, that damage per second growth stat indicates how fast the fireball stores damage up to a maximum. I tested this using cold alignment Spectral Scream against level 205 Steel Path Chargers, counting the amount of procs using primary Frostbite for more than 40 damage instances. With 401% strength, dealing 1,604 damage per tick, and dealing over 64,160 damage, the afterburn damage was still only 2,005. For comparison, a single charger at that level has 148,380 health. 2,005 damage is still only 1.35% of their health. Let's also ignore how the base damage of Spectral Scream is around 1% of a level 205 Steel Path Charger's health. Sure, the damage might be increased with buffs from Vex armor, but it still takes multiple seconds to kill a single chaff enemy. Plus, most enemies have armor and reduce the damage back down anyways. Chroma's second ability, Elemental Ward, is in a much better situation compared to his first ability. Like his first ability before it, Elemental Ward has 4 different modes that line up with his elemental alignment, and each mode applies a different buff to Chroma and teammates within 12 meters. The buff aura scales with his range. Heat Ward gives Chroma an aura of heat around him, dealing 100 heat damage in a fixed 5-meter radius around him with a 10% fixed status chance. It also increases his health by 55% additively to effects like Vitality. Both the heat damage and health scale with strength. Electricity Ward increases his shields by 30%, additive to base shield mods, and will fire arc discharges when hit, returning 1000% post-mitigation electric damage to a single enemy with a 25% status chance, both scaling on strength with a scaling 10-meter range. The enemy hit by the arc discharge doesn't have to be the same enemy initially damaging Chroma. Bolt Ward is far and away the most popular and most generally useful. It increases his armor by 145% and reflects gunfire back to enemies while increasing the damage of the bullet by 300% as cold damage with a 25% status chance, all scaling with strength. Hits and projectiles are reflected directly back to their source, while projectile attacks, for example bombard rockets, are sent back in the direction of the source, but are projectiles and are not guaranteed to hit. This ward also happens to be bugged to steal secondary fortifier, the reflected bullets giving Chroma overguard when hitting overguard, assuming your secondary weapon actually has the arcane equipped.
Not only will Cold Ward steal secondary fortifier, it will also steal melee influence. It's very good at crowd controlling an entire room once you have it procced on your melee weapon. Why it happens for either effect, I could not tell you. I have no shadow of a clue. It's likely because Cold Ward is just a really old ability. Toxin Ward is my favorite ward type, even if it's not as popular. In a 5-meter fixed radius around him, Chroma has a 50% chance to deal toxin damage equal to 5% of an enemy's maximum health, with guaranteed status chance. Unfortunately, this aura can't apply when there's a current toxin effect on the enemy, but as soon as the previous toxin DOT wears off, Chroma's Toxin Ward can apply its damage. Toxin Ward also increases holster damage and base reload speed by 35% each, both scaling with strength. Holster damage here counts as a universal base damage increase. We're going to come back to this later, because there's some very interesting and silly things that are possible with this ability. Elemental Ward has an augment called Everlasting Ward. This allows allies who leave Chroma's buff range to retain the buffs. Unfortunately, Chroma is a very selfish dragon and rarely has the mod space to use this mod. Furthermore, most builds in the showcase later will be minimal range builds, and most teammates won't step within 4 meters of Chroma every minute to gain the buff. Therefore, it makes more sense to use the mod space for more duration, strength, or other utility, like augment mods for subsumed powers. Elemental Ward is also the ability Chroma will donate to the Helminth system. Unfortunately, Elemental Ward performs extremely well on warframes other than Chroma, so sometimes Chroma himself is an optional piece in his own builds. Chroma's third ability is his Vex Armor, and it has become his trademark ability. While this ability is active, every point of damage Chroma takes to his shields will increase his Scorn, and every point of damage taken to his health will increase his Fury. Scorn increases his armor up to 350%, and Fury grants a universal base damage increase of 275%, both scaling with strength. Alternatively, melee kills stack Scorn, while primary and secondary kills stack Fury. Both effects are additive to their respective sources, so Scorn adds with effects like Steel Fiber and Cold Ward, and Fury adds with base damage effects like Serration, Hornet Strike, Pressure Point, and Toxin Ward's holster damage. Chroma emits these buffs in an 18-meter aura around him, sharing it with any allies. With most builds that Chroma runs, it's not unreasonable to sit with more than a 900% damage buff and 1150% more armor, which increases his base armor by 4,255 and 5,175 when primed. We'll talk about more armor and damage reduction stuff a little bit later, and how that relates to some of the recommended builds. Vex Armor's buffs are fairly simple to maximize. A total of 400 damage to shields, or 24 melee kills to maximize Scorn, and 19 ranged weapon kills, or 100 damage to health to maximize Fury. The ability is recastable to maintain the current buffs. What's interesting with this mechanic though is that when recast before the timer runs out, and with a higher power strength, and without the buffs having reached their full potential, the maximum will be increased to snapshot the new power strength the ability was recast with. Vex Armor also has the neat little property where it will increase the damage of both Spectral Scream and Effigy. The damage increase doesn't really make either ability good though. Vex Armor has two augments, the first of which being Vexing Retaliation. Upon taking 150 damage, Chroma will trigger a 9-meter radial explosion. Shield damage will force a single puncture proc, while health damage will force a single blast proc. Before I can thoroughly explain how dismal this augment's performance is, I need to first explain the landscape in which this augment was released. Firstly, blast damage type used to be a knockdown and did not use to stack.
In March of 2020, this status effect was changed, making enemies inaccurate for 6 seconds upon status application. Finally, in current times, Blast is a damaging status lasting for 1.5 seconds. Upon expiry, enemy death, or 10 stacks, the status explodes, dealing a percentage of the base damage. Puncture in 2015 made the enemies deal 30% less damage. In March of 2020, the status was buffed, and enemies with 10 puncture procs would deal 75% less damage. And again, in 2023, with the status effect changes, enemies with 5, the new maximum, would deal 80% less damage and had a flat additive 25% more incoming critical chance. For Chroma, enemies doing less damage is questionably nice, but the proc coming from shield damage in only a 9-meter radius is a death sentence for the augment. Furthermore, the changes to the blast status effect making this half of the ability useless as well. You may as well be healing the enemies with a depressing amount of damage dealt from one blast proc. The augment was released in April of 2015 and has not been functionally changed since, and is really showing its age. His second augment is far and away his most popular augment, Guardian Armor.
Wait, that's not what that augment does anymore. It does this instead now. Guardian Armor is Chroma's dream augment mod. First of all, Chroma reduces the damage his teammates take by 75% in his affinity range. Next, kills, be it from his teammates or kills he himself scores, trigger health regeneration equal to 5% of his max health over 3 seconds. Finally, kills will extend Vex Armor by 1 second. The maximum duration is equal to whatever the ability cast Snapshot. This augment gives Chroma so much energy economy, not having to cast an ability for 116 energy with Blind Rage every 35 seconds feels really good. Chroma doesn't get the 75% damage reductions his team gets, but he stacks so much armor and other damage reduction that being able to benefit from this mod would be absolutely broken.
This one mod giving so much of what Chroma wants means that on just about every build, this augment mod is an essential piece. Free health regeneration, offloading ability duration on kills, it's just like a dream come true. Chroma's fourth ability is his Effigy. Chroma takes off his skin and summons a sentry matching his currently aligned element that has 800 health and deals 400 damage per tick, both scaling in strength. It has 200 armor, an attack range of 20 meters, a knockback if an enemy is within 5 meters, and a roar that stuns enemies within 30 meters. When Effigy is active, Chroma's armor is reduced by 50%, and his move speed is increased by 20%. And the ability drains 50 energy on cast and 10 energy per second afterwards. Far and away, the most useful ability the Effigy has is its credit boosting ability, because the dragon should have the biggest horde. Enemies killed by % higher chance of dropping credits, and all credit drops within 10 meters of the Effigy are boosted by 100%. Effigy's damage, like Spectral Scream, can be increased by the damage increase of Fury, but only while the Effigy is within Chroma's range. Unfortunately, the base damage of the ability is a little too low to be viable into the Steel Path. The ability's augment, Guided Effigy, allows Chroma to place down a beacon, and the Effigy will fly towards the marked location, dealing 4,000 scaling damage per second to enemies in its path, and will refund 5 energy per enemy hit in its path, scaling inversely with ability efficiency. In addition to the pathetic damage the ability deals, the pathfinding AI the Guided Effigy has is just stupid. Before we move on to helmet options, I'll take a quick moment here to talk about damage resistance. Remember how Chroma can give himself around a 6,000 point armor boost with a fully stacked Vex armor and a Cold Ward? The way armor is calculated into damage reduction is pretty nifty. It's given by effective health is equal to nominal health times net armor plus 300 divided by 300. Chroma, using 401% strength and a rank 9 Umbral Fiber, with a maxed Vex armor with Cold Ward, has 10,119 armor, not counting other squad mate bonuses like Stand United or other similar effects. Using a rank 9 Umbral Vitality, he has 976 health. We can plug these numbers into our calculation. Effective health is equal to 976 times 10,119 plus 300 over 300, which is equal to 33,896 effective health points. If instead Heat Ward is used, things look a little different. Chroma now has 7,519 armor and 1,792 health. Our calculation now looks like this. Effective health is equal to 1,792 times 7,519 plus 300 over 300, which is equal to 46,705 effective hit points. This value multiplies with other sources of damage type modifiers like adaptation. And if you wanted to go even further beyond, onto your energy bar using quick thinking, incoming damage would take another 0.416 multiplier, only when your original health bar is depleted though. Please see the Kengineer for more information on this topic beyond this, but for our purposes, Chroma really won't be dying anytime soon against any enemies that you will be likely to see. Now that we know how damage reduction works, are there any mechanics that we can use and abuse to increase our damage? A little birdie told me about this cool little thing called multiplicative condition overload, and I have a friend here to explain to you how it all works.
Howdy y'all, Rowan is a Magman here. Okay, so multi-CO. What is it, how do we get it, and why and when do we use it? Are all very good questions. CO means Condition Overload, named after the mod Condition Overload. This melee mod provides you with plus 80% weapon damage per status effect on the target. These status effects include the 3 physical statuses being Impact, Puncture, and Slash, the 4 basic elements in Cold, Toxin, Heat, Electric, the 6 combined elements Magnetic, Corrosive, Radiation, Viral, Gas, and Blast, and rarer still are special statuses like Void and Tau, and finally the weird statuses like Lifted, Ragdoll, Knockdown, and Microwave, although keep in mind that Lifted and Knockdown are mutually exclusive. Now, the mod Condition Overload isn't the only form of this effect. Guns get access to it through the mods Galvanized Aptitude, Galvanized Shot, and Galvanized Savvy, giving this effect to rifles, secondary, and shotgun respectively. Now, this CO does have some limitations in that it doesn't work for certain types of attacks, like explosions and AoEs from the Ogress or embedded explosions like that of the Taurid. Normally, this bonus is additive with base damage, which for the sake of clarity, I will be referring to all of these base damage bonuses as Serration type bonuses, Serration damage bonuses, or Serration buffs, something along those lines. Well, as we know now, Chroma's Vex Armor is a Serration type bonus, and so the Serration type bonus on Vex Armor is additive with CO, meaning the more that you stack, the lesser the effects are due to diminishing returns. Except for when it's not. See, DE left some game in their bugs, don't worry guys, it's still in beta, and gifted us with variable CO. Basically, some weapons have variable CO values, meaning they get more or less of the effect than they should, such as the Multiplicative, which gets a whopping 4,100% of the effect of its CO mod, meaning each status gives us an extra 328% Serration damage. Other weapons, however, have significantly diminished values, such as the Ballistica's Charge Shot, and others don't even work at all, like direct hits from the Sonic Core. But here's where it gets real interesting, where we get weapons that, for some reason, have multiplicative CO, meaning that instead of being additive with Serration bonuses, it is multiplicative with Serration bonuses. Why is this so important? Well, generally, when it comes to modding in Warframe, you want as many separate bonuses which all multiply together to get the most damage. Serration damage, crits, damage vulnerabilities like Viral, multi-shot and status damages are all good examples of these separate bonuses, which when modified together, create far more damage than if you were to just say, run nothing but Serration type damage bonuses. Well, by making this CO multiplicative with Serration damage instead of additive, it results in a lot of extra damage for 0 extra work. Okay, so what does this mean number-wise? Let's take a weapon that does 100 base damage and slap on Serration for a 165% damage increase, bringing us to 265, and we're going to ignore things like crits and statuses just for the sake of the simple math here. If we add a max stack Galvanized Aptitude for an extra 80% damage per status, that would bring us to 345 damage with one status effect. Now, if this bonus is multiplicative with Serration, then we see the formula change to look like this. Now, I know that the difference between these two isn't all that much, but now let's replace Serration with a max stacked Fury, which, sure, is a more noticeable difference, but we're yet to mess with the number of status procs we get, so let's bump it to 5, which is a pretty reasonable number for any primal weapon worth its salt to reach. And now you can sort of start to see why separate multipliers is better than going all in on one stat. An over-investment in Serration type bonuses will see diminishing returns compared to that of separate multipliers. This is part of the reason why Viral is so prevalent in Warframe's current meta, as at max stacks it's another 325% multiplier separate to everything else. Thanks to Chroma giving us such a big number for Scorn, it means that on our weapon build, we can fully drop base damage and rely simply on Scorn to provide that instead, which allows us far more wiggle room to add other mods for even more separate multipliers, such as Bane's more crit, extra multi-shot, you get the gist. Most of the weapons with Multiplicative CO are projectile based, such as the Arcoplasmor, the Basmu's Primary Fire, and the Optonox. These weapons are ideal since you can effectively stack these separate multipliers for more damage. Unfortunately, no hit scan really has Multiplicative CO, which is kind of a shame. Hey, by the way, speaking of separate multipliers, did you know that Mag has a 2x damage multiplier on her Magnetize and an armor strip on her 4 with the Augment Fracturing Crush? This is essentially a 10x damage multiplier thanks to removing an enemy's armor and getting rid of that 90% DR. Anyway, so here's why you really want to play Mag instead of Chroma.
Alright. With that weird fever dream gone and done with, let's move on to builds. Now that we know how to boost our damage, we can see that he's spoiled for choice with his helmet ability options, because frankly his first and fourth abilities both suck and are easy slots to pick for a replacement. Generally, replacing his Effigy is my way to go, except for a few edge cases, and pretty much any ability you add will perform better than both abilities. I'll do my best to sort my list of subsumed abilities into a few categories, stuff like damage abilities, support abilities, and buff abilities. Damage abilities include stuff like Breach Surge, Nullstar, and Shuriken, support abilities include stuff like Evade, Omamori, Pillage, and Terrify, and buff abilities include stuff like Nourish, Wrathful Advance, and Shock with Shock Trooper. Unfortunately, Chroma's Vex armor is mutually exclusive with Roar, Eclipse, and Zada's Whisper, though I suppose the argument could be made for replacing Vex armor with these abilities because they are a different form of damage multipliers at the end of the day. All that said, Vex armor being a Serration type damage buff means that by abusing multiplicative condition overload, some impressive damage numbers are very easily achievable. Our first set of builds comes in two forms. One setup with minimal range, and another with base range. Unfortunately, they are all also fairly high investment, seeing as they are all triple Umbra builds. The basic framework is pretty similar though between the two. We'll start with Growing Power in the Aura slot, Umbral Intensify, Vitality and Fiber, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude and Power Drift for strength, and with Narrow-Minded and Prime Continuity for duration. Finally, we'll be using Guardian Armor for some serious energy economy combined with some passive healing. Chroma has pretty low energy when considered with Blind Rage, so Arcane Battery is an excellent choice. The other Arcane slot is rather free, but some options include Arcane Energize, Aegis, Avenger, Blessing, Escapist, and Mold Reconstruct. If you wanted to squeeze some more water from stone, you could consider Mold Vigor, but that might be more effort than the average player might want. You may also notice that Mold Augmented is missing from my list of recommended Arcanes, and it's not recommended for a single reason. Chroma doesn't really want to recast his Vex armor if he can help it, so when exactly are we benefiting from 60% more power strength when we're already sitting at 340% without Archon shards and growing power? The recommended shards for my Chroma builds going forward will be 4 Tau Forged Crimson Strength shards and 1 Tau Forged Crimson Duration shard, and will be therefore assuming that Chroma has a base of 160% strength and 115% duration. Anyways, let me recommend some Helmuth abilities for this setup. First and foremost, the usual suspects of Pillage, Gloom, and Nourish. Pillage from Hildren is a radial pulse which expands out from the caster for a duration, before reducing enemy shields or armor when the duration expires. With 400% strength, the ability cast is a full armor or shield strip to enemies inside the radius, which, with a duration stat of 230%, is 94 meters after 4.6 seconds. However, the ability is recastable to instantly end the ability and strip enemies caught in the radius on recast. Next up from our list of usual suspects, we have Gloom from Sevagoth. This ability is a radial slow, which also grants lifesteal to allies standing in its radius. With 400% strength, you far exceed the maximum slow of 95%, which is achieved with 272% strength, but are granted a 20% lifesteal. With 34% range, the radius is a low 5.44 meters. This works out nicely because with low efficiency, Gloom guzzles energy per enemy, counting up to 10 enemies within its radius. This energy consumption is compensated for by high duration, but even still, an ability drain that can drain this much energy per second is rough. To calculate the drain per enemy per second, we need to take a quick look at the formula for calculating the efficiency of channeled abilities. It's given by the final drain is equal to the initial drain times 100 minus efficiency divided by duration. If we insert our numbers, being 45% efficiency and 230% duration, and a base drain of 7.5 energy per second at 10 enemies, we get a final drain of 7.5 times 100 plus 45 divided by 230, which gives a final drain of 7.5 times 145 divided by 230, which gives a final drain of 4.728. Now, while draining 4.7 energy per enemy per second isn't necessarily hard to sustain, losing your energy fast because you stepped too close to 10 enemies and didn't instantly kill them all isn't my idea of fun, which is why I'm suggesting Gloom over the minimum range setup. For the last of our big three most common subsumes, we have the ever-classic Nourish from Grendel. With our 400% strength and 34% ability range, Nourish gives a 6.4x energy multiplier, gives our weapons 180% viral damage, and on hit, the Warframe explodes in a 1000 viral damage 4-meter radial explosion every 2 seconds, which applies 1 viral proc. The area in which our teammates receive this Nourish buff is only 8.5 meters, but it can be recast if ever a teammate is near. This ability is a classic for a reason. One more pick that fits into the category of minimum range builds is Omamori, taken from Kome. It's a bit of a quiet pick and doesn't really do anything flashy, but I found that it has saved my skin more times than I can count. Omamori grants an amount of charges on cast between 10 and 20. These charms passively grant the effect that, on hit, there is a 50% chance to negate the damage of the incoming hit, instead converting it into healing equal to what the damage would have been, multiplied by strength. After this healing triggers, this part of the ability goes onto cooldown, and the charms cannot be consumed for 3 seconds. But the 50% chance to negate the damage isn't removed. Frankly, I'm pretty sure that the reason Omamori isn't talked about more is because of things like Roar and Nourish existing. Our next two builds are similar, but instead of growing power in the aura slot, we're going to run Combat Discipline to guarantee damage to Chroma's health to enable Arcane Avenger. With that, our first build is going to be using Evade, straight out of a popular wuxia movie, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and taken from Site 09. This Hidden Dragon will be using the same build as before, except for the arcane enhancements will be Arcane Avenger and Arcane Crepuscular for a final 3x critical multiplier. This final 3x will really juice up our multiplicative weapons, but we'll talk about which weapons can take full advantage of this later. The invisibility is easily sustained with headshots, and the healing far exceeds the damage to health from Combat Discipline. Finally, for the last build that wants to use maximum duration and minimum range, we have a build that uses Wrathful Advance, taken from Kullervo. The donated Helminth version of the ability is heavily nerfed, but it is still a supremely strong ability for a melee-focused playstyle. Wrathful Advance with 400% strength gives 400% melee critical chance, and with minimum range, the teleport has a range of 4.25 meters. Granted, that is a fairly short teleport range, but the held version of the ability has a range of 8.5 meters, and doesn't need an enemy in range to be cast. The other downside of this ability is that some of your combo count are being used, but using weapons modded with high combo efficiency or high combo count chance can offset the trade-off. Also, the held teleport drains no combo, so that version is available should you not want to spend any combo. One variation of this build that I quite enjoy using is dropping Power Drift in the Exilus slot for Boreal's Anguish instead, which gives 75% less gravity and about 3 more seconds of aim glide, and using a weapon that has a ranged aerial attack and firing off high-powered melees from on high. With this variation, the single melee weapon I recommend is the Akenbrunt with the Incarnon evolutions, because ranged axes from slide attacks and aerial attacks have multiplicative condition overload. A super special thanks has to go out to Julio for putting this idea in my head. The second half of these max power Chroma builds use base range and other buff and utility abilities to round out his kit. By simply dropping Narrow-Minded, Chroma's duration drops to about 150%, but his range goes back up to neutral, or 100%, and also frees up a mod slot for anything that you may want in this slot instead. These builds I'll also sort into 3 halves: offensive, defensive, and utility. This is far and away the longest section for builds, because shocker, most abilities in this game like having lots of strength. We'll be using Growing Power in the Aura slot, Umbral Intensify, Vitality, and Fiber again, Blind Rage and Transient Fortitude for power strength, Prime Continuity, and the ever-present Guardian Armor. Finally, Power Drift in the Exilus slot is a good choice. This leaves us with one final mod slot to use for any augment mods or other utility. Our arcane enhancements are once again very flexible, but I still suggest running at least Arcane Battery for the energy economy. Our first build will be offensive. We're going to be using a nuke with Nullstar from Nova, and use the Neutron Star Augment. Nullstar on its face doesn't seem like an offensive ability. While high, the damage comes out in 1 second increments, dealing 1200 blast damage at 400% strength. The ability also gives a 5% damage reduction per particle, maxing out at 75%, which is achievable with only 4 Nullstars at 400% strength. The amount of particles scales off of duration, and with 140% you have 16 particles orbiting you. So why do I keep calling this ability an offensive type ability? Well, first you have to know that there is a certain subset of abilities that are affected by universal base damage increases. To talk about this, we need to take a little bit of a detour to explain what the heck the wiki page is talking about, if you look this up, when it says that universal base damage increases apply to certain abilities and is multiplicative with ability strength. Now, for the life of me, I could not find the mathematical equation that describes how this specific interaction functions past the Google AI summary, which frankly I trust less than the distance that Chroma can breathe fire with narrow-minded equipped. So I had to do the math myself. The way that the damage is calculated in Warframe is given by final damage is equal to initial damage times 1 plus elemental damage plus IPS damage times 1 plus Serration type damage bonuses times 1 plus faction damage times other damage multipliers like viral, that sort of stuff. And a lot of that isn't applicable to our situation, but remember, ability damage scales with strength. For our purposes, abilities like Nullstar act like weapons and are put into the initial damage slot, and our girthy Vex Armor buff goes into the 1 plus Serration slot, because the ability gives a universal base damage increase. Now, back to Nullstar, which is the entire reason why I've brought us down this tangent in the first place.
The ability does 300 damage at base. With Intensify equipped, that's multiplied by 1 plus 0.3, which makes 390. Vex Armor at base is an increase of 1 plus 2.75. Nullstar at neutral strength with Vex Armor becomes 1125. With Intensify equipped, Nullstar with Vex Armor is 300 times 1.3 times 1 plus 2.75 times 1.3, which all total is 1784.25. As you can imagine, because both the original ability's damage bonus scales with power strength, and our universal base damage increase also scales with power strength, things start scaling very aggressively, very quickly. What if we did this entire thing with 401% strength? We would have 300 times 1 plus 3.01 times 1 plus 2.75 times 1 plus 3.01. That all condenses down to 1203 times 1 plus 11.0275, which comes out to a total of 14,469.0825. When we add the augment mod Neutron Star, which scales in the exact same way, it's another damage instance. Our numbers are off the charts. 14,469.0825 from the base ability, plus 240 times 1 plus 3.01 times 1 plus 2.75 times 1 plus 3.01. Condensing all that, we get 14,469.0825 plus 962.4 times 12.0275. That becomes 14,469.0825 plus 11,575.266, which totals out to 26,044.2935 damage per orb. All that isn't even considering the ability has 16 orbs per cast, nor is it considering the heat and blast damage that is applied, nor is it considering a whole bunch of stuff which my collaborator Sherman Strett calculated out for use with Nova. Thanks for letting me copy your homework. Wait, before you go, there is a known bug with Neutron Star, which is... My lawyers have advised me to gatekeep this information.
Alright, now that we understand why Nullstar is an obvious pick for Chroma, we can look at the short list of abilities buffed by universal base damage increases that are also in the Helmet system and pick from there. Oh hi, Breach Surge! Breach Surge from Wisp is affected by universal base damage increases in the same way that Nullstar is. That is to say, the damage of the ability can get a little bit crazy, with the scaling and a 100% critical chance and a 1.5x critical multiplier. That's not even the best part of the ability, but before I get ahead of myself, let me tell you what the ability does. The cast releases an expanding energy wave targeting all enemies in line of sight within 18 meters of the cast location. Enemies hit by this wave are blinded, and have a 10% chance when damaged and a 100% chance when killed to release a Surge Spark. Do note that damaged means damage, so lingering gas clouds, melee influence procs, companions, etc. will all have a 10% chance to proc a Surge Spark. The damage of Surge Sparks is calculated by multiplying the damage of the effect that procced the spark, then multiplying by 2, scaling on strength. The only downside of the ability is that the damage from the Surge Spark is capped, even if the cap is 5 million damage. The way the damage of the Surge Spark is calculated is given by this formula. Surge Spark damage is equal to the damage of the initial hit times 2 times 1 plus ability strength times 1 plus universal damage multipliers. This looks a lot like the formula for Nullstar, doesn't it? That's because it's the same. Now remember from before how things scaled very aggressively when we added some power strength, and apply the same principles here again. Using a 401% strength chroma, we get Surge Spark damage is equal to the initial hit times 2 times 1 plus 3.01 times 1 plus 2.75 times 1 plus 3.01, which is Surge Spark damage is equal to the initial hit times 8.02 times 12.02. Remember, the damage of the Surge Sparks is capped at 5 million. However, we can easily calculate the minimum damage. We need to max out the damage of a Surge Spark. We do a little bit of math here. Surge Spark damage maximum is equal to the initial hit minimum times 8.02 times 12.02. We rearrange a little bit here. Surge Spark maximum is divided by 8.02 times 12.02, which will give us the initial hit minimum. Now remember, our Surge Spark maximum is 5 million. So we do 5 million divided by 8.02 times 12.02, which will give us our initial hit minimum, which is 51,867. And with numbers like that, Chroma will easily be able to fire out repeated max damage Surge Sparks when the minimum damage needed to max it out with this build is only 51,867. Unfortunately, kills with Surge Sparks don't proc more Surge Sparks. Armor also reduces Surge Spark damage, but on the upside, the Sparks critically strike and hit headshots, sometimes will also deal way more damage than they should. Not really sure why myself, but they just do. There are two more options that are increased by universal base damage increases: Shuriken from Ashe and Smite from Oberon. In testing, however, both these options are mid at best and bad at worst. Upon closer inspection, Smite isn't actually as bad as I originally had made it out to be. Screw you, Harvey, for making me revisit maths. Smite blasts an enemy for minimal damage before sending out damaging orbs for a total damage equal to 35% of an enemy's health, plus 150 times strength per orb. I originally discounted this ability from my recommendations because with high strength, the damage per orb goes down, and the remultiplication from Vex armor simply isn't enough damage to bring the numbers back up to serviceable levels. However, this ability when cast on, for example, a corrupted heavy gunner, can occasionally clear out some chaff enemies with questionable consistency. So then, what exactly is going on here? That same corrupted heavy gunner, at Steel Path level 200, has 690,117.75 health. Smite damage orbs would deal a total of 241,541.2125, split into however many orbs your power strength creates, plus 150 times strength times the number of orbs. For example, at neutral strength, each orb does 40,256.86875 plus 150 damage. At 401% strength, each orb does 10,064.2171875 plus 601.5. With a max stacked Fury buff at 401%, that number gets multiplied. 10,064.217875 plus 601.5 times 12.02, giving a total of 128,201.92 whatever. And keep in mind that this is also damage per orb. There are 24 orbs going out, all doing this same amount of damage. Reduced again by armor and faction damage type modifiers, all that jazz. This is a lot of damage. Notice, however, that the damage per orb always goes down. I would also like you to notice that the total damage goes up as strength increases.
The problem with Smite is that it's a little bit inconsistent. The orbs have strange targeting, so while success is possible, and frankly a little bit more likely than not, there is a degree of variance for which I'm not really a fan. It is not, however, as bad as I originally thought, so thanks again, Harvey, for reminding me that I'm actually bad at math. Shuriken has fringe use cases after update 38, Tekrod Encore, where Shuriken will add 1 point to the combo counter for each Shuriken that hits. If you hit all 5, that's 5 combo. Other than that, though, the ability is middling at best. For our last real offensive options without dipping into the specialist category, we have Amir's Shock with the Shock Trooper augment, and from Gauss we have Thermal Sunder with a Thermal Transfer augment. Both of these abilities do the same thing for our purposes, buffing our weapons with the elemental damage given by the augments, so I'll go ahead and talk about them together. Using these abilities with their augments gives the caster and their allies within range a buff that grants them elemental damage and status effect damage. Volt has a 1-to-1 scaling with strength, while Gauss has a 3-to-4 scaling with each individual element, but has a 3-to-2 for his combined element of Blast, which is heat and cold combined. We don't actually particularly care about what the actual abilities do, but at 401% strength, Shock Trooper gives us a 401% electricity bonus to our weapons, and Thermal Transfer gives us a 601.5% blast damage bonus. A very nice damage bonus, and a bit loosey-goosey with DE's decision of not letting Chroma get damage-boosting abilities with Vex Armor like Roar, Zada's Whisper, or Eclipse. But hey, we play by the rules in this house, and snag a tasty elemental damage bonus instead. Our next subset of builds that want high strength but also neutral range are our utility builds, and we'll start this section off by talking about armor strip abilities that want neutral range. And the first on my list is Terrify with the augment Creeping Terrify. Taken from Necros, this ability sends out a Psychic Blast to 20 enemies within 15 meters, scaling with power, strength, and range, sending them fleeing and panicking away from the caster. The ability also reduces armor by 60%, scaling with strength. This ability is fairly simple, and when cast with our 401% ability strength, we can affect 80 enemies within 15 meters and are stripping them of so much more than their maximum armor, as the breakpoint for a full strip is 167% strength. The only downside of this ability is that enemies while panicking run around at Mach speed like chickens with their heads cut off, but this downside is easily fixed by using the augment Creeping Terrify. At base, it's a 60% slow to terrified enemies, scaling with power strength, and the maximum slow is 80%, which is easily maxed out with our Chromos build. Next up is Tempest Barrage with Viral Tempest. On cast, an area of 10 meters is marked, and the area is hit with an orbital cannon barrage, with 4 cannonballs hitting per second, and each exploding in a 5-meter radius that it scales with range. The strike deals 300 corrosive damage, with a forced corrosive procs, which staggers enemies. Then, with the Viral Tempest augment, each cannonball forces a viral proc as well. Put simply, if you want to lock down an area, Tempest Barrage is your go-to option. It's also supremely useful at priming enemies with the viral effect, but it's also no slouch for priming for condition overload effects too. Our next 3 I'll discuss together, because they all behave similarly, though not quite the same. Coil Horizon, Pull, and Airburst all have grouping tools that function well at neutral range, pulling enemies to a point, be it on Coil Horizon's bowling ball, Airburst's point, or right in front of you with Pull, and ragdolling enemies. Larva also fits under this category. Having enemies grouped up like this makes it very useful for weapons that have lots of punch-through or AoE effects, and makes them really shine. However, these 3 abilities are more situational than anything else and should really only be used if you're using a weapon that really appreciates the grouping. Of these abilities, Coil Horizon is probably the best. It has the most range and does electricity damage for the purposes of priming. Its only downside is the way it's cast, like a bowling ball or a softball throw. You could also use Larva in this place if you wanted to, because it's great, but its Helminth nerf reduces it from 12 meters to 8 meters, so it's not as good. Wow, we really are spoiled for choice in builds, huh? All that without getting into more specialized builds. Our specialized builds are by no means any more powerful than our generalized builds, but can be a nice change of pace if you get tired of using the same old thing over and over again. In this section we'll be covering the max range builds, the summoner build, and 2 special builds cooked up by myself and Rowan from the Rowan is a Mag main channel, and with a little bit of help from Amelistic, the premier Rhino enjoyer.
you should go check out both of their channels. Starting out with our maximum range build, we'll be running Growing Power in the Aura slot, Umbral Intensify and Vitality, Primed Continuity, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, and now Overextended and Archon Stretch for range. In the Exilus slot, we have options here: Power Drift to edge out a little bit more strength, or Cunning Drift for a little bit more range.
Guardian Armor is a default slot in here, as with all the builds today.
This setup uses the same Archon shard setup as before, that being 4 Tau Forged Crimson Strength shards and 1 Tau Forged Crimson Duration shard. This setup, along with being an easy slot into a for fun C configuration on your Warframe, has the added benefit of also counteracting the negative strength penalty from Overextended, so the penalty from that mod is completely negligible. The entire reason to run this setup comes from a line of thinking I shared when talking with my good friend Full Moon Joker, around when I got back into Warframe. The thought process of max range Chroma being that even with a weak build, your Vex armor buffs are high enough that killing things is easy, so why be selfish? Why not share with the team? Vex armor's maximum buff does take a little bit of a hit, but sometimes I think it's fun to see your entire team run around with around a 740% damage buff and 80% more maximum shields if you're using Electric Ward. This build's stats are 235% range and 269% strength, or 250% range and 254% strength, depending on which Exilus mod you pick, not including Growing Power. I'm of the opinion that this aura is optional, and another team buffing aura is completely fine to slot in its place, too. Next up in our specialist builds, we have the Summoner build. No. Next up is the first real specialist option, and it's a pick coming out of left field: Pyrotechnics. On cast, the Warframe sends out 5 pillars of flame, erupting below enemies up to 25 meters away, dealing damage and forcing a heat proc. The pillars try and auto-target enemies in your reticle, but can do some crazy things when grouping is involved. Go watch Rowan's video on this for more information. For this build, we'll be running a similar setup to the neutral range builds from earlier, but instead of using the full triple Umbral setup, we're going to be swapping Umbral Vitality for Archon Vitality. To explain why, I have to explain some strangeness to do with Pyrotechnics, starting with the fact that it does benefit from universal base damage increases. However, the next bit of strangeness is to do with its scaling with strength. Every 20% increase in strength increases the amount of pillars of flame by 1, in addition to increasing the damage of each pillar of flame. With the current setup, we're sitting at 384% strength, with Umbral Intensify and Fiber, Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude and Power Drift, 125% duration with Prime Continuity, and space left over to slot Guardian Armor and Equilibrium for the energy economy. With 380% strength, we have 19 Pillars of Flame, each inflicting 2 heat procs because of Archon Vitality, with an 11.56 multiplier from Vex Armor. This is the kind of build that really lives up to Chroma's aesthetic of being a fire-breathing dragon that Spectral Scream fails on every attempt at offering up. Our last build in this section has quickly become my favorite. I've taken it to level cap and cascade several times and iterated on it with the help of some very knowledgeable people, so another special thanks has to go out to Rowan as a Magmain and Amelistic for being my rubber duckies and explaining how the heck Toxin Ward works. This is also combined with Melee Afflictions, which is another extraordinarily obtuse arcane in this bug full of game, so bear with me while I explain how it works. The arcane reads as, enemies afflicted by status effects gain 6 additional stacks when knocked down or flung by melee attacks. Now that's very obtuse, and on its face seems pretty simple, but when considering damage over time effects, it becomes very complicated very quickly. So the wiki doesn't explain this mechanism super well, and I could not find any place online that would show it to me with an example of the mechanism that would let this arcane scale so aggressively. So, first things first, when you hit an enemy with an attack that would proc melee afflictions, the game looks at the status effects currently affecting the target. For non-damaging effects, it's simple, +6. For damage over time effects, the arcane looks at the average damage of all the damage over time effects. It takes the total damage of the proc and divides it by the number of procs for that status type. That then gets stored as the average status effect damage. Melee Afflictions does this for all damaging statuses, and then adds the average status effect damage together. Then, when applying the new status effects, deals a single hit equal to the sum of all the average status effect damage. This new damage over time is affected by elemental bonuses, status damage bonuses, and faction damage bonuses. Faction damage bonuses actually applied once in the super hit and once again in the DOT calculation. Every subsequent time Melee Afflictions is applied, this process is repeated and the damage goes up. The real magic is when Melee Elementalist is also around, which is one of the things that can really scale the damage of these status effects fast. Let me run through an example for posterity. Say for example a target has a single toxin proc that would deal 10,000 damage total, a single slash proc that will deal 1,000 damage, and a single gas proc that will deal 5,000 damage. Melee Afflictions would see the average status effect damage of 16,000, and would deal a single hit back worth 16,000 that procs 6 stacks of toxin, slash, and gas. And for the purposes of this example, your Melee Afflictions weapon is equipped with Melee Elementalist. No elemental damage bonuses, just Elementalist. For Toxin, we have 16,000 times 0.5, which is the DOT multiplier, times 1.9, which is the Melee Elementalist multiplier, times 6, which is the amount of status effects applied. That's 91,200 total damage, but the average damage is 15,200. It's the same for gas, and slash is 16,000 times 0.35 times 1.9 times 6, which is a total of 63,540, or an average of 10,640. Now on the second go around, Melee Afflictions would see the average status effect damage for all these DOT effects being 41,040, and the status effects would scale off of the new number of 41,040. On the third application, the math goes up to 105,268, though not that many enemies will be around to experience a gamut of status effects scaled that hard. Now that we have a rough idea on how Melee Afflictions works, remember how I mentioned that we'd circle back to Toxin Ward later? Well, now it's later, and we have to learn how to juice the ever-living Void out of the Toxin Ward. Remember, Toxin Ward's Toxin effect deals 5% of an enemy's maximum health. Tau Forged Emerald Toxin damage shards are an essential way to boost this damage, as they are the only way to boost the damage of Toxin Ward, because they act like some sort of strange status damage bonus mod. Now, when applying Melee Afflictions with 5 Tau Forged Toxin damage shards, plus 225% damage, and Melee Elementalist, the damage does a line and goes crazy. We'll still be using the same starting values of 10,000 Toxin, 1,000 slash, and 5,000 gas. And remember, after 3 Afflictions applications, we had a base value of 105,268 without the Toxin shards. Toxin shards here are additive with Melee Elementalists, so that's where they'd be added into the equation. 16,000 times 0.5 for the Toxin damage multiplier, times 1 plus 0.9, that's 90% from Melee Elementalists, plus 2.25 from 5 Toxin damage shards, times 6 is equal to 199,200 damage total, and an average Toxin damage of 33,200. The slash is 16,000 times 0.35 times 1.9 times 6, which is equal to 63,840, like last time, which on average is 10,640. And the gas is 16,000 times 0.5, the gas modifier, times 1.9, Melee Elementalist, times 6, for a total damage of 91,200 and an average damage of 15,200. On the next application, Melee Affliction sees an average status effect damage of 59,040, and on hit number 3 sees 217,858. As you can see, the damage is more than doubled from without having Toxin damage shards equipped. This is actually a level agnostic one-shot, so damage really in these setups is never an issue. For this long endurance setup, we'll have some way of guaranteeing that you won't die, and I recommend Omamori, but shield gating with Brief Respite and Arcane Aegis also works. Health and energy tanking will serve you to around level 6000, but that's about when enemies do your entire health bar with one attack, so a combination of movement and speed is required after a certain level. My favorite weapon, bar none, to use with this setup is the Telos boltace, because of its unique ability, Stormpath. On a slide attack with Stormpath, the ability will activate, pulling enemies within 14 meters, clumping them up around you. Your next slide attack will send out a wave that lifts all the enemies that you just grouped up. Remember, melee afflictions applies on lifted status, and the first half of the weapon's ability has conveniently grouped up a bunch of enemies around Chroma, and they're a lot closer than the 5 meter range of Toxin Ward. This leads to funny situations where you come across a group of enemies, slide into them, and literally explode all of them with your second slide attack. The only downside is that when you use this setup in a Void Cascade run, the Stormpath ability tends to strap the Thrax units to an ICBM. They're getting launched, and there's not much you can do to stop it. The problem comes in when the Thrax ghosts have to get killed. The Thrax ghosts pop up out of the corpse, and with the corpse is loaded on a rocket, the ghost spawns on the other side of the room. You can also bootleg this same setup with most heavy slams, but those are boring. The Archititron gets a pass because of its unique gimmick in its electrical damage procs. Magus Anomaly plus Harmony is also a very strong way of doing it, with Size neutral combo having a Force Lift and Heavy Attack having a Force Slash and a Knockdown, combined with the Harmony unique gimmick of Expedite Suffering on the Heavy Attack. This also buffs status duration by 30% across the board for yourself and allies in affinity range, which by proxy actually does increase the damage effects boosted by melee afflictions. Now that we have some builds to work with, what weapons are we adding to a Chroma main's arsenal? Well, to start with, the easiest way to decide what weapon to use is picking any option off of this list, and choosing your pick of the litter, and abusing the void out of multiplicative condition overload. However, I can confidently make several recommendations, which will serve you well enough. The Tenet Archiplasmor, the Aelak, the Alternox, the Exergis, the Felarx, the Coda Base Assist, the Bubonico, the Nadaruk and the Cinta, and several Incarnon modes, including the Latron, Miter, the Dread, and the Paris. The Catchmoon, Tombfinger, and Sporelacer primary kit guns are also multiplicative in primary form. For secondaries, you're also spoiled for choice. Both modes of the Epitaph, the Mighty Seer, the Sepulchrum, the Angstrom Incarnon mode, Kunai Incarnon, and Onos base form, and then Catchmoon and Tombfinger make a reappearance, multiplying again in secondary form. Other options that you have aren't necessarily multiplicative with condition overload, but do some strange things with it, like the Mutilus Cernos Uncharged Arrow, which adds, instead of multiplying, but adds at 4100%. And then you also have the Grimoire, which acts as a primer and a strength steroid at the start of a mission, with using the Vom Invocation, giving your Vex armor and other Subsumed options a 60% increase in strength. Melee weapons are a little worse off for Chroma, but despite the changes in 2019 and the introduction of the Old Blood, which was update 26.0, and condition overload being changed from a final multiplicative bonus with the old melee system to a Serration type additive melee increase with this new system, the mod is still multiplicative on certain melee weapons. The few weapons that still benefit and that are also useful on Chroma are the Corifels Heavy Attack Projectile, the Siam's Heavy Attack Wave, the Vertilac and Neferi unique combos, the Ceramic Daggers Incarnon Heavy Attack Projectiles, and the Aken Brunt, which we mentioned earlier, Spectral Axes. This, however, does not mean normal weapons aren't good. Every melee is usable with around a 1000% damage bonus. Another class of weapons that Chroma can use and abuse are thrown melees. Glaive Prime, Codopathicist, Zorus, Falcor, and the Wolf Sledge. The reason why is that Glaive Explosions are multiplicative to base damage and apply twice. These weapons are a little bit boring, but they work very well. You really can't go wrong with these. It's also a crime that the Wolf Sledge can't use thrown melee mods. Come on, DE, fix this please. Gunblade and heavy spam setups also greatly benefit from high base damage due to the combo counter being an additional multiplier. For example, Redeemer Prime, the Slamistar, the Cybear, weapons like that. Now, a side benefit of Chroma's Vex armor being a radial buff is that companions can also receive the base damage increase. Sentinel weapons, while not having the highest base damage to increase, still appreciate being bumped up 2 whole orders of magnitude. If you're running one of the Chroma builds that uses high range, your other companions like Hounds, Predicites, and Kubraus, and Kavats can also benefit from Vex armor. For some reason, companion summons through Duplex Bond also inherit Vex armor, but for robotics, a form of targeting precept needs to be equipped, for example, Assault Mode or Hard Engage. Posture mods function in the same way for Beast companions. This works well with the max range setup from earlier, as Beast companions are more likely to stray away from your neutral range of 18 meters. Now that you know what Chroma does, generally how to play him, and some weapon synergies, the question now becomes, what do people think of his current state? So over the course of writing this script, I've interviewed multiple Chroma players to see what they think. The general consensus is that Chroma's kit is very one-dimensional, single-minded, and flat. My friend Rowan even described him as 1.5 abilities with a gun, and the most common line of commentary I got from my interviews was that his first ability was forgettable and never worth casting, and even called a weak belch, with the common thread between all of these polls being that the ability may as well do no damage. His second ability also got some mixed reviews, some calling it fine, some calling it forgettable, but the usual response was that the numbers are low compared to enemies in the steel path, and it doesn't scale well. In contrast with the rest of his kit, Chroma's third ability received great reviews from all the players I asked. The base damage of the ability was mentioned several times, and so was the change that allowed Chroma to stack his Vex armor with melee and ranged weapon kills. And finally, his fourth ability has been ragged on by every single respondent. Just about every part of the ability, except for the Gradius boost, has been universally reviled. It has no impact on the endgame, the energy drain is too high for what it does, it's basically a weak turret, the Effigy doesn't even survive at higher levels, the armor penalty, being 50%, is too steep for the power received in return, and the Effigy knocks enemies away from itself, and is rooted in place. Wow, I think I just described the ability. Everyone hates it. Looking through the patch history, the ability hasn't changed in more than 10 years. So all I can assume is that DE thinks that this ability is fine, but please hear me when I say this entire video is nothing more than a plea for a complete rework. DE, I'm on my hands and knees. Chroma sucks and is barely treading water with a massive weapon damage buff, and I beg of you, make this complete video completely invalid by just fixing him, rework him, do something, just not what he is now. It ain't it. Ain't it at all. Not to seem unfair with all this dogpiling on Chroma's kit, I took a look at how outdated it is in comparison to the rest of the game. I took a look at the Warframe release order and which Warframes were released around the same time, and directly before Chroma we had Mesa, and in current day, Mesa is the 11th most popular Warframe. Directly after we had Equinox, who was also in dire need of a rework, but we had Atlas after her, and Atlas just got a huge buff with the changes and removal of pseudo-exalted weapons. After that we had Wukong, who's gotten reworked and is now the second most popular Warframe. This comparison goes in both directions. Before Chroma, we had Limbo, Mirage, and Hydroid, and 2 of those frames are absolutely top tier, while one of them has a self-synergistic kit that when mastered can do some crazy things. Take a look at Sci-Fi Freak on YouTube for some examples of this insanity that you're able to pull off. Now, back to the topic of my interviews. In terms of visual design, almost every player I surveyed say that Chroma, in his primed form, wasn't really a dragon per se. Instead, most respondents said that they thought he looked more like a regal dragon knight, or a dragon warrior, or an ancient hero. Which then begs the question, what design decision is DE trying to go for? Which design language do they want to follow? Would they prefer going for a dragon knight type thing? Or would they prefer going for a more dragonic theming, taking after Dungeons and Dragons in their rework, which hopefully is soon. Therefore, I have also been brainstorming ideas for some rework ideas that could bring Chroma up to parity with Warframe's current cast, including taking another look at his augment mods, because the creative director of Warframe, Rebecca Ford, says this during a dev stream.
Hinged fun. I said augment slot, but I meant an augment using a slot. You only have so many slots. If you're going to put an augment in one, it better be worth it. I see.
Absolutely.
These, then, are my ideas for an almost complete Chroma rework. First things first, a complete passive change is in order. The credit boost from his 4th ability is rolled into his passive, and since it's now always active, you gotta reduce it to 10% instead of 100% to keep it fair. The triple jump is interesting, but I wish the wings were a little bit more visible, or at least more visually striking. Now, the coup de grace. Chroma's weapons have a 15% chance to apply random heat, cold, electric, or toxin procs using the base damage of his weapons. The idea is to play into the elemental Lord of Ruin theme, making him more of a force of nature and leaning into the chromatic dragon side of him. His first ability I would change to a duration-based AoE elemental field, where enemies within 6 meters of Chroma have a 100% chance to take base elemental status effect once per second, with heat, cold, electric, and toxin each having a 25% chance of applying. The status effect chance would scale at 1 to 2 with ability strength, so at 200% strength would yield a 150% chance, and 50% strength would have a 75% status chance. This field would not be refreshable and would scale with range. I would also make this ability's DOT scale with enemy health or level to give him at least one option to deal with super high level enemies. Now, for his second ability, don't panic! I would remove the team buffing aspect from this ability. In exchange, it's now a channeled ability, and kills and assists within its radius would steal a single heat, cold, electric, or toxin proc off the slain enemy, each one increasing Chroma's health, armor, shields, and weapon dexterity up to a maximum of 40 stacks per type, and all 4 being active at once. These buffs would have to be a little lower than they are on live today, but having all 4 would at least be more interesting than only ever being able to pick one, which is usually cold, and leaving it at that. The buff maximum would scale with strength, and the theft would scale with range, starting with a base range of 15 meters. Vex armor? I leave it as is. No notes. And now for the pièce de résistance, his Effigy. On cast, Chroma would drain 50% of his current Vex armor to explode in a 30-meter radius with a 100% status chance, proccing all 4 of heat, cold, toxin, and electric, while at the same time spawning an exalted, moddable beast companion, Effigy. At base, the duration of Effigy on the field is 30 seconds and is moddable with beast mods, has beast claws, and is able to equip exclusive precepts. They are as follows: Dragon Fear, stunning enemies in a 10-meter radius for 6 seconds with a cooldown of 15 seconds. Dragon Rush, charges at an enemy, damaging all enemies with heat, cold, electric, and toxin, type damage in his path with a 5-meter AoE, and exploding on arrival in a 10-meter AoE with a cooldown of 10 seconds. Now, Dragon Breath, the Effigy would shoot a fireball in heat, cold, electric, toxin type damage in a 10-meter radius, 6-second cooldown. Its claws would be heat, cold, electric, toxin at base with much lower IPS values, and these elements would not combine. Elemental mods applied otherwise would combine normally. For example, heat plus toxin being gas. Now, in addition to rethinking abilities, I also rethought augments for all of his abilities. His first augment would be a change from duration-based field around him to a tab cast ability. Chroma would breathe fire, sending out a ball of elemental damage that explodes on impact with a 10-meter base range. The damage is heat, cold, electric, toxin typed with a 100% base chance split evenly, and leaves a lingering field with a 6-second base duration. Think Nightwatch Napalm for the Ogress. His second augment would reduce the max stacks held by 50%, but enemies Chroma kills or assists in killing would explode in a 6-meter base radius with heat, cold, electric, toxin type damage with a 100% base status chance.
The recent changes to Guardian Armor make Chroma one of the best supports in the game, giving his team a global 75% damage reduction while within Chroma's affinity range. No notes, no changes, it's fine as is.
His fourth augment would be an Effigy transformation. Instead of summoning an exalted beast, Chroma would become the Effigy, retaining all of his abilities. His melee attack would use the exalted beast claws, the fireball would become his primary fire, and the alternate fire becomes the charge. Each would cost a little bit of energy to use, and holding would end the ability. This would be similar to the old channeling mechanic from Melee 2.5.
I think that just about does it. I've said everything I'd like to say. That's what Chroma is, how you play him, what to use with him, the helmet abilities I recommend. Hell, even a rework idea. I have so many people I'd like to thank. I'll put their names on screen because there's just too many to thank in words. Is that so? Yeah? I think I have to go feed my cats, guys. I'll see you later.